No, I love the web. I think it's one of the most powerful and important inventions of, well, ever. It's changed the face of technology, of culture, of society. But designing for the web, yeah, it kind of got a bit dull. I think we'd hit this era of stability where we had known solutions to known problems. We had sites that ended up kind of looking rather the same as each other, as we just saw in the last presentation. Our profession had matured, and the roles and the processes within that had started to ossify. We had designers who did a certain thing, and content, people who did a certain thing, and so on. It was all very, very lovely, but also a bit drab. The good news is that was never going to last. This is the web, after all, and then the thing the web teaches us is that change is inevitable. And I think within the industry now, there's this creeping feeling that maybe we haven't really been seeing the full picture. And so some of the pioneers of the industry are talking about new techniques, responsive design, fluid grids, media queries, all this sort of stuff. But really, I think we've only scratched the surface of what's coming our way. But you know, you're all smart people, right? You know what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the mobile web, of course. Well, actually, no. For me, the mobile web is a red herring. There's a false dichotomy, I think, that pervades this industry, that places the desktop web in opposition to the mobile web and sees them as two different, independent things. It's an attitude that regards the mobile web as an add-on to whatever's gone before. It's a way of thinking that we can update our old processes. You know, we make an iPhone site in addition to the existing website. But that way of thinking for me is based on a whole set of assumptions which are basically just wrong. The idea of mobile is often stated that it's conflated with public transport and low bandwidth, touch screens and small displays and so on. Now these assumptions are way too broad even now, and they're going to become frankly ridiculous in the next couple of years. So I wrote a whole bunch of this talk on a train bumbling along the south coast of England, one of those really dreadful, slow, stops everywhere kind of trains. I was extremely mobile, but I was working on a 13-inch screen. I had a full QWERTY keyboard. I was connected to the internet through my iPhone, so I had some connectivity, which ranged from pretty good 3G to nothing whatsoever. So during the process of that, I visited a whole bunch of websites to do research and to get images and so on. And I wanted the full web experience, not some cut-down nonsense mobile web, because I was deemed to be a mobile user. So I contend that there is no mobile web, there is only the web. It's always been intended for use by different people in different situations with different devices. It's only now that we're starting to realize the effect that has on our design processes. So for me, the mobile web is a subset of what really matters, which is something I call the wider web. And the wider web is the same web that we know and have loved for many years now, but it's a web that's faced with massive diversity of contexts, of inputs, outputs, devices, bandwidths, and ecosystems. And I don't think we have a clue just how different this is going to be. The revolution's on our doorstep, but our processes are still stuck in the last decade. I still see very skilled designers creating and designing sites exclusively for people with a keyboard and a mouse sat at a desktop somewhere in an office. The wider web is going to force us to break past this limited, constrained thinking, these easy cliches and these false assumptions. And it's going to force us to embrace the diversity of what the web really is. So to my mind, the best way to understand the nature of the wider web is to look at its constituent axes. The first is context. So context is really about people and their position in space and time. Where are they using this application or this service from? How do they get there? Who are they with? These sort of things, they make a profound difference to the way that people interact with technology. Now, it's easy to get overexcited and overload the context term. We start asking silly questions about, oh, what's the weather like? What's people's emotional state? What do they have for breakfast? Because that's going to change the way we design for them. But the truth is that context really is important because it helps us to focus on the people who are using our services and not just the device they're using it with or the tasks that they come here to fulfill. So it's been the case that over the last few years we've typically thought of the context of the user being normally someone sat at a desk. That's still the case. There is still a static context, as I call it. Some people like to call it a desktop context, but it could just as easily be a comfy sofa. And The static context really is a place where the user the environment is optimized for the user. So they might have relevant information to hand, they might have pen and paper to hand, reference books, they might have those passwords that they always keep forgetting stuck on a post-it note on their screen. I'm sure you've seen that sort of thing. So the static context is where the user is comfortable and stationary and able to focus. And we've spent a whole lot of time trying to optimize our designs for this type of use case. Generally, it lends itself quite well to deeper levels of use, larger tasks and long spells of research, like researching a new topic, something like that. Now we're seeing this growth in what's termed the mobile context. Again, I think it's a term that's maybe cluttered with some unnecessary assumptions. For instance, it's very easy to think, well, I'm mobile, therefore I have a poor connection. It's possible, but it's by no means a guarantee. I may be mobile, but sat in on a train that has fantastic Wi-Fi, for instance. But generally in the mobile context, this sort of if you like, the polar opposite of this static context. We see that devices tend to be portable. They'll tend to have, therefore, smaller screens. And also because the user is faced with unfamiliar surroundings, they may be giving less attention to using the technology in question. They may have more geographical information needs, for instance. Google now say that 33% of queries that come from smartphones are to do with where the user is. And since the user doesn't have access to the static information, the environment that they were comfortable in previously, they may lean toward these brief interactions because they may be interrupted by what's happening in front of them. So we now have to consider a whole range of contexts. Now these are the two extremes, the static and the mobile. But the reality is that in truth these aren't diametrically opposed, and most real world use cases are going to lie somewhere in the middle of this. But we need to understand the effect of context on the services that we build and the apps that we provide. And the best way to learn about this sort of thing is, of course, to research it. Simply to get out there, do a bit of design research and watch people use the service if you have one already, or use some prototypes to see the sorts of scenarios that they're going to be using these things in. Your users will be using them in far more nuanced circumstances, after all, than these two previous extremes of context. The wider web also presents us with a huge diversity in display technology. The most obvious change is that screen sizes themselves have changed. This used to be something we took for granted. Everyone had a 14-inch CRT monitor that tended to have sort of 1,024 pixels on it, for instance. Small screens are obviously now creeping into our lives. We're all familiar with the rise of that. But also, the screen sizes are getting substantially larger as well. A 50-inch plasma telly is just as legitimate a display for web content as a 3-inch iPhone. So there's some real untapped potential in designing for both of these extremes. And at the other end of the small end of the scale, we have a real challenge on how do we fit the endless need for features and brand propositions and content and so on into a smaller screen to make it legible, accessible, and inviting. It needs a ruthless prioritization a focus on prioritization and the value that the service brings to the user. It gets more complex still because smaller devices are handheld. So they can be held in a number of different orientations, typically landscape and portrait. Now at worst, we can look at that and say, oh, Christ, this is more work for us. We've got to design two different layouts for two different orientations. I think it's better, though, to consider it integral. It's part of the way design is going to be done over the next, however long, certainly for the lifetime of the screen as an output method. You may find that one orientation, for instance, is preferable for your application or for your website. But insisting on a particular orientation is exactly the same cardinal usability sin as resizing the user's browser, which was all the rage back in the day and hopefully is dying out. It's really saying, in effect, that you know better than the user. It's a terribly arrogant thing to impose. And of course, the screens themselves, they're changing substantially too. The pixel density, some people might call it the resolution, but let's clarify that terminology. The number of pixels per inch makes a very big difference to legibility and a user's ability to resolve detail. And again, this is becoming a fantastically diverse ground for designers to have to consider. We now have CRT monitors at sort of 72 pixels per inch still, a couple of them are still around, up to the iPhone Retina display at 326 pixels per inch. The good news is that this is probably going to become less of an issue with time because the general trend for density is upwards, And once you hit 300 or so pixels per inch, the human eye can't actually resolve any more detail than that. But this is still very much an issue that we have to contend with right now. Not only when we're developing for iOS, for instance, we have to create graphics at different sizes for the iPhone 4 and for the 3GS and so on. But also, we need to consider the capabilities of the device. If we've got a low resolution screen, is that really going to suit long, detailed interaction and reading and small typefaces and that kind of thing? Are they optimized for the task at hand? The density of pixels also has an effect on the resolution of the screen. This idea that we used to have this common 1024 pixel width, it's already dead, but there isn't any clear replacement. What it used to be was we went up 640, 800, 1024, and so on. There is no clear replacement for that now. Instead, diversity wins. On very large screens, what you tend to find in research is that users don't maximize those windows anyway. So there is no clear point at which you can mark your new design optimized. So any pixel width between sort of 300 pixels up to 3,000 is now entirely legitimate for the web. And again, this is going to keep going up with time. We also have to consider different aspect ratios, so different ratios of width and height. There's 4:3, there's 16:9, 15:9. Different content, therefore, appears in different places on different devices, and there's nothing we can do about that. We have to let go of that fact. So given this astonishing diversity in displays, creating a fixed 1024 pixel experience is now lunacy. We have to move towards working in proportions rather than pixels. We need to turn to fluid layouts using percentages and relative measurements that will allow content to reflow onto any device that accesses the services we're building. And this is not an easy transition by any means, particularly because the software that we use to make our websites and our apps, things like Fireworks, Photoshop, and so on, they inherently use a static canvas that's fixed in space. It locks down dimensions. Even paper, if we're sketching out ideas, has the same problem. It's a two-dimensional static medium, whereas the web is this kind of strange, stretchy space-time. There is no right size for the web canvas. There's no way around that. We have to therefore pick where to start, but be mindful of all the other different screen sizes, resolutions, orientations, and so on. But what does matter is that we bear all those in mind throughout the design process. And it's not just the outputs that are changing, so are the inputs. The trusty mouse has been with us for a very long time, since Doug Engelbart demoed it in the 60s. They've become a lot more sophisticated now. Of course, we're familiar with some of them having touch-sensitive surfaces, so we can combine gestural interactions. They may have user-programmable buttons and so on. We've got pretty good, I think, at designing for the mouse user. We know of things like Fitz's law, which is a extremely useful law, which basically, in essence, says make your click targets big, and they're easier to click on. We also have trackpads, which basically handle very similarly to mice, in that they map physical motion to motion on the screen. So we're fairly familiar with how to design for these. And usually, we also have a nice piece of knowledge that they're bundled with a keyboard. And again, we've become relatively good at designing for keyboard use in today's software. But it's tempting when we talk about a keyboard to think of a standard QWERTY keyboard, right? But there's no reason why a keyboard needs to be that way. It could be an older mobile keyboard, or it could be a BlackBerry keypad or something like that. It could be a soft touchscreen keyboard that's on something like an iPad. So either way, keyboards are generally optimized for quick text entry, right? So they lend themselves particularly well to that type of data input heavy product. We also come then to touchscreens. There's obviously a lot of focus on touchscreens right there. They're undeniably sexy. They're often labeled intuitive, which is another of those slightly misunderstood terms. But it's clear that mapping the natural actions of touching and pointing to interaction on some kind of screen is definitely natural. I mean, even toddlers know how to use the touchscreens, iPads, and so on relatively well. The mentality of moving from a keyboard and mouse paradigm to a touchscreen one is far more complex than just replacing a click with a tap. we have to, for instance, consider the ergonomics of the thing. It's very easy to forget that the user's hand is opaque. So when we move over the touchscreen, we're obscuring part of the interface. And not only that, if your user's left-handed, they'll approach it from a different direction and obscure a different part of the screen. We need to make sure that our controls are fingertip sized. Generally, that's about 9mm for the pads of our fingers. How that translates to pixels, well, that depends on the density of pixels you have. You again see how much more complex this gets. There's no hover state on a touchscreen. So basically, we have to ban hover states from our web designs. Now, a good principle when we're designing with touches and gestures is what's called to let them dissolve into existing behavior. So if we have something that users are in the habit of doing anyway, then try and use gestures that map to those natural actions. So waving goodbye to close an application, for instance, is a very intuitive gesture for that action. The idea of pull to refresh, I'm sure many of you have seen that in the Twitter app for iPhone. That was a relatively recent innovation, but that succeeded because it mapped the action of scrolling that list down and gave really good feedback while that was happening. And of course, there are more inputs on the horizon as well. It doesn't get any easier. We've got free space gestures. This is the extension of the touchscreen really into 3 dimensions. It's already in consumer technology. It's in the Kinect. It takes a lot of space. The user needs to be able to flail their arms around a little bit. It's also a little bit difficult because you get what's known as gorilla arm. Is this a term anyone knows? It's a term for the pain or the agony you get from holding your hand in front of you. So you know Minority Report, right? And everyone says, wow, that Minority Report interface is sexy. And they're all doing this with their arms. If they did that for 10 hours a day, it just wouldn't work. Their arms would be the size of tree trunks. But anyway, these kinds of inputs, accelerometers, GPS, I mean, I could go on. This list is getting extremely daunting. So again, the lesson here is we need to avoid the assumptions that we can do it the way we've always done it. And we need to consider the full breadth, the full number of permutations that are available within today's technology, let alone what's going to happen in the next 5 to 10 years. So a small screen could, yes, could be a touch screen, but it could also be paired with a Bluetooth full-size keyboard. It could be accessible through pulling in accelerometer data or GPS data just as much as any of those other methods. So again, learn about your users through study and consider all of those different options when you're designing these services. Next axis I want to touch on briefly is connectivity. It's very much a volatile commodity. I think its lows and its highs are growing even further apart. The ISPs are trying to usher in these gigabit networks, and they're all boasting about their speed. The mobile operators are struggling with capacity, and they're trying to limit the consumption of bandwidth by their customers. There's one obvious principle here, which is that we need to try and design to conserve bandwidth. And this isn't just a good thing for people on poor connections. This is a good idea for any type of development. So we need to keep our code tight, but more importantly for me, we need to keep our designs tight. It means that we have to fight against these bandwidth-sapping bits of content that really add no legitimate value for users. Stock images of smiling women with headsets and this kind of stuff. They basically just make your website useless for anyone on a poor connection. There's a guy called Brian Rieger, who's a mobile expert. And he speculates that the pressures of bandwidth conservation are going to become so great, or might become so great, that eventually we're going to have to communicate how much data our app uses. Just like when we build, when you sell a fridge, you have to talk about how energy efficient it is. We're going to have to do the same with our apps. How data efficient are the services that we make? We even need to start thinking about the offline user. Now, this seems a bit unintuitive, a bit strange, because the web has always been an online phenomenon. You've needed to be connected to it. Well, actually, there's no real reason why that needs to be the case in future. A lot of recent progress, HTML5 offline storage and things like that, means that there are now legitimate ways to use the web offline. Now, the offline user may have just lost technology, or they may want to voluntarily enter this mode, because being offline obviously confers quite a few advantages. It removes interruptions. It means you can focus on watching a film or writing an article or so on in peace and quiet. But for me, perhaps the biggest impact the wider web is going to have is that we need to start thinking of digital ecosystems rather than individual apps and sites. handhelds and TVs and PCs and laptops, they're all really forming part of a joined up world with these various touch points forming part of this larger service. And that can even include offline interactions, going to the store, really as part of the same thing now as visiting a brand's website or using their iPhone app. Even now, users are switching extremely fluidly between devices. So you might get people sharing a touchscreen tablet to play a game on the commute to work, and then the loser might spend a bit of time in the office just looking up his statistics so he can be a bit better next time. Do that on the desktop PC. And it's tempting to think that what we need to do then is design for a consistent experience across all of these things. Right? That's the obvious first step. I'd actually contend what we need is coherence rather than consistency. Instead of being identical, the cross-device experiences should use the strengths of each device to their maximum. So if we have, for instance, a mobile phone that offers a GPS unit compared to a desktop computer that doesn't, what advantages can that confer? How can we use that unique feature to our benefit? Same thing's happening with our content. Users are beginning to push content between devices, something known as content shifting. So I can now use a wireless printer to get a web page and convert it to paper, pretty obvious. I can also use an iPhone to push video from my phone to my TV. I can save web pages to my Kindle using Instapaper. But yet we still think of our content as wrapped up in bed in the environment that we put it in. But that's not going to happen for long. Where users read our articles and watch our videos and see our images, well, they're going to be stripped from their original place and consumed wherever the user wants them to be. That could be on the device that's next to them, or it could be as they're on the move and so on. The idea of content shifting doesn't make the advertisers happy for obvious reasons, but I contend that mostly they have themselves to blame. Really, this is the advent of users fighting back against the degradation of the reading experience online. And so what we're seeing now with content shifting is there's a real resurgence in the idea of long-form content. People reading deep, intelligent articles online. This whole myth of people don't read online is becoming even less true than ever. So the main purpose of this talk is really just to scare you, I think, with the enormous diversity that's coming our way in the next couple of years. The number of permutations of all of those axes is just phenomenal. It's a far bigger canvas than we painted on up until now. But let's spend the last 5 minutes or so just looking at the potential impact on the digital design industry. One thing is that we can't create perfect mock-ups for 20 different screen sizes and 5 different input types and so on. So we're going to have to move to a much more modular approach to design. Instead of giving pages and screens, we'll have to give our clients libraries of reusable elements that can slot in different permutations and combinations. The analogy I use there is that in essence we're going to have to give people the Lego bricks and a couple of schematics of how they can be assembled into a dinosaur on a racing car, rather than give them a plastic model that they can't unpick. Here's one example. This is something called a page description diagram. So a guy called Dan Brown came up with these. And the idea is that it's really splitting a design into its component parts. So you can design individual sections, and then you can give instructions for how those could be reassembled in different contexts, different pages, different screen sizes, and so on. We also need to look at how we document interactions that cross all of these different channels. This is something called a swimlane diagram. This is a little project I did for ITV a little while ago. Just shows how the user's journey is far more complex than we used to think it. It's not a question of sitting at the computer and finishing the task A to B. Really, it involves different channels. That could be print, it could be offline, it could be mobile, it could be a whole host of different things. This reminds us to consider the variety of contexts and the entire user journey that's involved there. But for me, the most critical approach is that we have to move towards prototyping rather than documentation. Prototyping is really the only way that we can mimic the true experience on all of these different devices. We've got to get them on the devices to see if they work properly. There are a whole number of different tools we can use. They're fairly immature, but there are so many that I think anyone who's interested in doing some mobile prototyping can now find a tool that suits them and get up to speed with that pretty quickly. We will then early in the project have to choose which of these enormous number of combinations we choose to support. There will be some projects, for instance, where we can say touchscreens aren't a factor because we know it's an intranet, everyone's using a keyboard and mouse. But that easy solution is going to ebb away eventually with time. Now, the good news is that support doesn't have to be a binary choice. It doesn't have to be, yes, we fully support touchscreens, or no, we don't. Just like the idea of browser support, the way we can target different browsers, we can build a baseline experience and then augment that, use the idea of progressive enhancement as it's known, to try and offer a better experience for those specific combinations that we want to dedicate extra time to. But for me, critique is going to be the central tool for handling what's coming up, for advocating this wider web mindset. We need to start giving designers a really hard time. So when you see a design that's a fixed width or something like that, ask them, well, how's that going to work on a mobile? How's that going to work on a 50-inch telly? How does that work with a touch screen and so on? And right now, if your designs don't work with touch screens, for instance, if they don't work on a small screen or they don't work with low bandwidth, then you are failing as a web company. So we have to keep hammering home that very point and appreciate that these permutations and these axes, they aren't edge cases anymore. They're the real nature and the flourishing of the web. So we've got a whole period of figuring everything out all over again. It's going to take a whole load of adjustment, but it's not optional. We need to adopt this mindset today and start educating our clients and our paymasters and just absorb everything we can about how to meet these new challenges. So it needs looking at successful practice. It needs us to read the material, the papers, the books that people are writing. We need to absorb the interface guidelines. We need to learn about these different platforms and devices. But ultimately, we need to experiment because design is about trying something, seeing what works, and learning from that. So please experiment and please iterate and please report back on what's worked because we are all in this together and there are substantial challenges ahead of us. And I don't think we need to be depressed by this big change that's heading our way. Just as it's tempting to think, just as we were getting somewhere, it becomes even harder to create good user experiences, right? But I think this is healthy. The web is finally becoming its own medium. It's becoming liberated from the constraints of a specific device or a specific context or a format. In essence, it's entering its difficult teens, and it's going to go out and it's going to try and find its true identity. It also means you can't control it. You can't ground it and confine it to its room. And until now, we've tried to do that. We've designed these fixed, prescribed experiences. And in doing so, I think we've become really good at designing computer screens, but I don't think we've really understood how to design for the nature of the web itself. So it's time, I think, for us to let go and to see what happens next, because the next phase of the industry is definitely here. If you'd like to know more, please keep an eye out for the book next year. And please do buy me a drink later and let's have a chat. And thanks a lot for your time.